Welcome to Conversational Christianity, the show where the topics are difficult and discussions are deep. Where we learn to live, love, and grow in community by challenging the status quo of faith. So, keep an open mind and an attentive ear. And thanks for joining us for this week's conversation.
Welcome to Conversational Christianity. It is our very first episode. I'm joined here with my good friend Alex. Alex, we've been friends for, golly, man, 2 decades, almost 3, probably.
Getting close to it. Getting close to 3, yes.
Every day, it feels like.
Yeah.
But, you know, we've been good friends for a lot longer, or not a lot longer than we've known each other, but we've been good friends for quite some time. And, you know, I think with episodes only being 30 minutes, and one thing that I've actually already heard from people who have known that we're going to do this podcast is 30 minutes long enough to have a conversation? And truth is probably not. To which point we'll say that if we do have conversations that are longer than 30 minutes, they'll be busted up into episodes.
Right. Well, I also I've been a teacher for part of my life, which means that I'm prone to ramble as well. So I'm going to try to avoid doing that as much as possible. So, you know, it could easily go more than 30 minutes. It's like our good friend Mark Roth would always say, somebody that's raised in a Baptist church, what does the clock mean to them? It's absolutely nothing.
Nothing.
So, yeah.
Nothing. No, but, you know, I think that's really, you mentioned Mark Roth, and you mentioned, you know, these are people in our lives, a lot of our lives, just jumping right in. This first episode is titled What and Why. And I think if you're doing a pilot episode for any podcast, that's what that episode should encompass, is the what and why. And so for us, the what is conversational Christianity. And so in our first 30 minutes together, in our first episode, I kind of want to answer that. I want to answer, you know, what is it and why? And, you know, I'll give my side first, and then, you know, kind of let you talk a little bit about that as well. Because I know that, you know, I reached out to you not long ago, just a few weeks ago, and mentioned to you that I would like to put together a podcast. And we'd been talking about some things, and discussing and we have these conversations a lot, and we discuss these, and you and I have these conversations, and then I have a lot of these conversations with other people. But, you know, it got me to thinking, like, if we're having these conversations and other people are having these conversations, these are really good conversations that I'm gleaning a lot from. Would other people glean from those conversations? And are they having similar conversations? So that's where the name Conversational Christianity comes from. And so when I actually hit you up, you're one of the busiest human beings on the face of the planet. And so when I hit you up, I didn't think there was any way that you were actually going to go for it, but you had mentioned that, you know, maybe starting a podcast was something you had thought about. So I'll kind of let you jump in and talk a little bit about that, you know, right now.
Well, I when I say that I was going to start a podcast, that was very much in the, you know, pie in the sky top thoughts of years from now, all of this different stuff. I've kind of got into listening to those. I've always been a music person throughout my life. But in the last couple of years, I've listened to a lot more podcasts and just different things, some things about religion, some things that are just goofy about sports and all kinds of different things. But when you had approached me about this, one of the things that's been on my heart a lot lately is, how can we effectively not only disciple the people in our own lives? And not to say that I know everything, because I certainly don't, but I think that a lot of times we can learn from each other in pieces of scripture. There's a lot of things that I've learned from you about just life in Christianity, and how to kind of blend those two things along with everything else we've got in the world, raising kids and learning how to do that from people a lot older than us. And then even people that are younger than us that seem to have it more together than I do at the age of 31. So the idea was very intriguing to me to be able to do this and just kind of see where it goes. You know, like I've mentioned to you, Dalton, you know, like, if I'm being honest with anybody that's listening to this, one of my fears is that I don't have enough time to be able to commit to it what I want to be able to do. right? Like I don't, one of the things that I try to take pride in is to not halfway do anything, right? I want to be prepared. I want to be able to think things through, especially when it's weighty matters. So on these conversations, for me, what I want to be able to contribute and talk about these things is not to just come in here and just blow smoke, right? Like I want to be able to come in here and, like, if we're going to talk about, marriage, or if we're going to talk about grief, or we're going to talk about, whatever it may be, or maybe something directly in the Bible or something that's going on in our lives, that it can be a pointed conversation where we're not just going to be rambling and get off subject and all of these different things, but that we can kind of get to the heart of the matter, like we do if we would be sitting around at Taco Bell just talking, in the middle
Yeah.
of the evening, or if, as you and I have done in the past when we were teenagers, folding bulletins at Brown Springs Baptist Church, and the deep conversations that come in just random times, that you don't expect them to be. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm excited for, is to kind of see just where it goes, having a little bit of preparation, but then also trying to, um, you know, just see where the conversation ends up taking us.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you kind of hit a lot of great points there so the what for conversational Christianity is simple. It's conversations about our faith. And that could be terrestrial type things, or tertiary, I guess I should say, not terrestrial, but tertiary things, in that things that affect us. You mentioned marriage, you mentioned grief. Those are things that are in everyday life. And I know that in church life, they're spoken of a lot, but it's almost like it's buzzwords and not necessarily actually brought out in the open. And some people are very, very good at being able to go to those who are hurting and those who are experiencing grief, or to newlyweds, or to people who are married and they're just struggling in their marriage. Some people have the ability to go and have those conversations and be that sounding board for people who are in those times, and just help. Others don't, or they just feel uncomfortable doing it. But they have opinions on marriage. They have thoughts on grief and the best ways to get through it and things like that. And so, what this is just a conversation about a lot of those things. And so, one thing I think is great about both you and I doing this podcast, as opposed to me and really anyone else, is that you just mentioned there that you are a planner, you are a mathematical person. Things have to have order and organization. And not to say that you're not creative, because I think anybody that knows you knows that that is really far from the truth. My kids have been rocking out to some Living Testament lately. They keep asking for the Living Testament disc.
That's
Um,
right. It's a good one.
it is, and actually, at some point in these conversations, buzzword there, in these conversations, I want to bring up some of the lyrics that you all probably you have written in some of those songs, and just really the deep meaning that those have. That what I think is interesting is that I don't think that you, as a 16, 17, 18-year-old kid, really understood the weight of what you were writing or that you were singing. But it's so deep now, as a 30 plus year old individual with a wife and a family and a worldview that has changed drastically since I was, 18, 19 years old and a Christian. It's wild to me, like, how that was written more than a decade and a half ago, and it means something totally different to me now. And that, we'll save that for another conversation. But the what of this is just simple conversations about topics, about issues, about whatever the case may be, but about our faith and how we believe, and why we believe what we believe, and how we got to the belief that we have, and the knowledge that we have that drives those beliefs, and why we think that that's good. One thing I do want to point out, and you mentioned that you like to be really prepared, and I don't like I'm it's not that I don't like to be prepared, I just don't thrive in the preparedness. um but with that being said, the biggest thing about this whole podcast, what I want this to encompass, and what I hope that it encompasses, is that we don't want to claim to be subject matter experts on everything we're talking about. Um, And I think that's got to be first and foremost understood, because the reality is that we're not. There's going to be areas where we do have a good amount of knowledge, and probably a lot more knowledge than most people who are listening. But there are a lot of areas where we don't. But the whole point of this podcast is for you to not listen to the podcast and say, "Oh, Alex and Dalton, they're experts, and so we must believe exactly how they believe." We just want to present our opinion and have a conversation. And, this is what I believe, and this is what you believe, and this is how we got there, and have that conversation and capture those conversations. And then the hope is that in the future that listeners will put in their own questions and their own topics and their own opinions that we can discuss. And we will from time to time have guests on the show and pick their brains and get their opinions and things as well. And so that is the what. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
I think you said it pretty well. Um, we've been very lucky, or at least I consider my very lucky, very blessed that I feel like in important moments of my life in middle school, in high school, and in college, I have had different people that have helped walk me through a lot of issues that I didn't know how to walk through. And again, it's kind of the same thing. Not saying that I'm a subject matter expert on anything to those effect, but how many people do we see that it seems like that they may not have somebody to walk through some of these things that are subjects that a lot of times we assume to be true.
Yeah.
That maybe they are true, but do we understand why they're true? Do we understand why we believe those things? One of the things for me that I'm thankful for in my background is mathematics. Anybody that knows me knows this, that I'm a nerd through and through. And I remember taking this class in college called modern geometry. And the short version of it, that it was so aggravating, was that, a triangle has three sides. And if you know
Yes.
much about triangles, you know that triangles, their angles, their interior angles add up to 180 degrees. Okay.
That's
And if you
about
don't
all I
know
know about
that,
triangles.
okay, well, there you go. There's something, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't know that, there you go. There's your knowledge of the day, your math knowledge. We might have that as a segment every single time. Here's your math knowledge of the day. But anyways, I remember being in that class and them saying from day one, you can't assume this to be true. And how frustrating and how aggravating it was that, you could have two angles that were 60 and 60, and the third one, you couldn't assume it to be 60 until you had proved it. Right. Now, in faith and in theology and Christianity, proof is kind of, I think it's antithetical to faith, because that's the whole point of faith. But in the same effect, I think that sometimes that we have to go back and lay the foundation for why we believe the things that we do.
Yeah.
That way, that when we get to these anecdotal statements about things that we believe or things that we say, that we can just be very, very clear that we're not just saying what our parents believed or what
Right.
our pastor told us to believe or what somebody else told us to believe, but these are actual things that we believe. These are
Yeah.
actual things. This is our faith. This is our relationship with God. This is my relationship with God in the way that I understand it. And is it always right? I don't know. I'm constantly figuring that stuff out. I can assure you that the way that I think now is different than 5 years ago and 10 years ago, and will probably continue to change. But even still, I am thankful that my math background has kind of taught me how to do that, because I feel like it has changed the way that I approach the Bible. It's changed the way that I approach anything that I hear when I'm listening to somebody else. I've had to learn to be less critical sometimes, because I think I can try to apply that too much. But even still, that is one of my visions for this. In the what is, can we break what we believe down to the basics and say, okay, yes, we absolutely believe this, and make sure that that foundation that we're sitting on is rock and not sand.
Yeah. And you mentioned that that's a great what, but I think that leads us into the why.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that the why this podcast, why Conversational Christianity, why the title, why the premise of a podcast like this, and that's exactly it. What you just described is the very foundation for the why, in my opinion. And why I think that it is important that a podcast like Conversational Christianity exist, and why I think it's important that we document these conversations and we continue to have these conversations, is because we live, again, we aren't subject matter experts about a lot of things, but the only place that you and I have ever experienced Christianity and organizations of faith and ways of believing and worldviews and things like that is in the South. That's where we have our experience is in the South. And arguably, there are a lot of commonly held beliefs, not even just in religion or faith, but in politics and the teams that you like. I mean, the type of sports that you like. There is a culture of pride in the South that is, it's really strong and it's really passionate. But you mentioned about when it comes to matters of faith, like, is it our parents' faith that we're just kind of bringing into our own and saying, this is what I believe? But I don't think that any longer, we can just rest on, well, I'm a Christian because I've been in church my whole life. I'm a Christian because mom and dad and grandma and grandpa were Christians, and that's just what I believe. I'm a Christian because I'm Republican. I'm a Christian because it doesn't matter, insert whatever. I'm a Christian because the reason you are a Christian or the reason that you believe anything, there should be a solid answer. Now, when you give your answer, there may be people who start poking holes in what your answer is, and that's okay. But I
Yeah.
think that what happens so many times in modern Christianity, especially in America and especially in the South, if we're continuing to be very granular in what we're talking about there, what happens is around us and what we've experienced is that one of two things happens when people start to question either our faith or someone else's faith around us. One of two things happens. I think that what happens first is that you either immediately reject the hole poking of the person who's questioning what you believe. You reject and label them as ignorant or worldly or whatever you want to do. You just label them as somebody that's that uh, the desire to reduce the cognitive dissonance of I'm right, they're wrong, and they have to be wrong for me to be right. And that's what's most important is me being right. So that's the first thing I think happens. But the second thing, the other alternative is to that, to somebody poking holes in our faith, is that we just lose our faith altogether.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
we we start to question ourselves. And what happens is that we understand that we don't really have a foundation. I don't have a foundation for why I believe that a virgin, since we just came out of Christmas season, why I believe that a virgin was impregnated by the Holy Spirit and that this child was born as part man, part God. And I don't know why I believe that. It's just because ever since I was a kid, that's how we've celebrated Christmas. And I saw
Mhm.
that Jesus is the reason for the season. And, it's when people say, well, you say that he resurrected from the dead. How does this make sense? And you're like, well, I don't really know. It's just we've always celebrated that at Easter.
Right.
And I'll let you jump in here, but I think those are important things. And because those are the two immediate reactions, or not even immediate sometimes, but those are the two reactions that we experience. It's either A, completely reject and, push these people away as if they are outcast or, wrong or ignorant or stupid, whatever we have to do to lower that amount of cognitive dissonance on ourselves, and then to validity, give our opinions and thoughts validity. And that's not okay because you're pushing that person away and
Mhm.
you're devaluing them as a human being, whether you think you are or not, you are. And the other one is not okay because you're literally walking away from a faith and your entire identity, probably, if you're like us, your entire identity, because you were asked questions and instead of doing the work to figure out why you believe what you believe, it just crushed you.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I mean, we even see this in the Gospels, right? Like something that made me think that I thought of as you were speaking on this is Nicodemus, right? Nicodemus is somebody who is well known in his faith. He is a Pharisee, a well respected man who comes to Jesus in the middle of the night asking about uh salvation and whatnot. And when Jesus tells him you must be born again, he doesn't get it, right? He doesn't get it at all. And you have to wonder how much that kind of hurt him, and like
Yeah.
not being able to understand. And we see in his response whenever he's like, like, Jesus, what do you mean, basically? And Jesus says, you have to be born again. You have to be born of the Spirit as opposed to just being born of water. And we kind of walk
Right.
away from that conversation not knowing how it goes. But then at the end of John, we see Nicodemus actually coming back to put the spices and the oils and stuff on Jesus's body to help give him a proper burial. And Nicodemus probably had no clue of what was coming with the resurrection, just as the disciples, as much as Jesus had told them. Everything that we see shows that they did not understand what was there, right? But it affected them and it made them think. And I think what we can hope, and what we hope that we do with our faith, is that when we do get these holes poked in it, that we don't just walk away from it, right?
Yeah.
That, as mentioned, rocks versus sand, that our faith is founded on rock, that even when the waves hit and the storms come, that it still remains. It may have been shaken a little bit. Been plenty of times that, I mean, I've mentioned to you many times, and other times when I was in college, I almost walked away from the faith
Yeah.
just because I was burnt out. I was frustrated among all of these different things. But what I'm thankful for is I had people, again, in my life in different places that was able to help walk me through and say, look, all these people that you trust and these people that and these church fathers, they believed despite, you know, having questions, going through these hard times, and yet they still were there. And it really
Yeah.
helped me understand that. I think for me, like, talking about why, one thing that I hope that we can get into a lot is something I'm very passionate about in the church is unity. There are so many different denominations just within the Protestant church. Protestant being, basically, if you don't even know what Protestant means, right? Protestant is going to be anything that is not Catholic and
Yeah.
anything that would not be an Orthodox church, right? So
Right.
if you saw like Eastern Orthodox, or if you saw like, again, a Catholic church, not really talking about those, but within the Protestant church, anything else you can think of: Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, Church of God, Church of Christ, Assembly of God, you name it, non-denominational, so on and so forth. All of that is Protestant churches. And why are there so many different churches? And not only that, but within the same church, you can have so many people with such vast different political beliefs. And a lot of
Yes.
times a single church may be completely rallied around a single political belief. And that's antithetical to even what Jesus did. Like, one of the things that I've been really passionate about lately is thinking about in Jesus's disciples. You may be familiar that, like, Matthew was a tax collector. He was a pawn for the Roman Empire, right?
Right.
And nobody liked the tax collectors. You have like Peter, who is a fisherman, and James and John, who I believe were also fishermen. But Peter gets a lot of times as the fisherman who would have had no sort of training. So they're just kind of there. Matthew is the tax collector, and he is kind of the bad guy there. And then you also have this guy that's a disciple called Simon the Zealot. And the reason why he's called a zealot is that was a group. There's like different groups of Jews, and zealots were people that thought that they wanted to overthrow the Roman empire with force, with
Right.
violence. So
Right.
they literally thought that if you had the chance to kill a Roman soldier, you should take that. Like, that's what they thought. They were straight up like uprising type of people. Yet Jesus recruited that guy and the guy that was the pawn of the Roman government, Matthew. And you have to wonder if if Simon the Zealot ever thought, man, I could get rid of this guy right here and continue on with my thought. You have to wonder if that ever went through his head. And yet he found his allegiance to Jesus above those things. That's something that I'm very passionate about, that I think that we have to get back to in an upcoming election year, as we get online, and the more online that we are, and the things that we fed try to polarize us even more. Our allegiance has to be to Jesus and King Jesus above whatever our political affiliations are, because if it's the other way around, we're going to continue to see the church structure crumble and not be that city on a hill that we hope that it can be to the people that desperately need to hear the good news of the gospel.
Yeah. Uh, You're right. And so I think that from a very foundational point, and as we build toward you know future topics and future conversations that kind of entail pieces and part and whole of what you were really just alluding to. You started out and you talked about, even in your time in college, that you nearly walked away from the faith. um I would say that there are a lot of people who, if they were being honest and being very truthful in 21st century America, Christian 21st century America, they would say the same thing. They would say that they've had a time, no matter how short of a period, they've had a time or are experiencing a time now in which they felt like, they had no other choice but to walk away from the faith. But I think it's important, again, when we're faced with those things, whether you do walk away from the faith or not, before you make a decision either way, you have to have a foundation. And one of the things that I think is important, and I've spoken with you about this, and I've spoken to other friends about this as well, but one thing that we have to realize that is uber important is that we make some wild claims as Christians. And you're not going to we make some claims that are not provable physically. And I think that's, to me, and just looking from an outside and just having way more conversations in the last 20 minutes with you, that's probably one reason why you struggled in college in a math, having the studies that you did in math, and then just being who you are, and really wanting to be able to prove things, and math being able to prove it's a science, it's a discipline, I should say. That sounds more academic. It's a discipline where you can have a right answer, and you do need to solve, and you do need to show, and things like that. And so the way that some people's brains work is that it has to have an answer. There has to be a reason. There has to be verifiable proof that this is the way that it is, because if it doesn't, then it's kind of like music. Whenever it doesn't resolve, it feels like it's still left incomplete. It's not closed like a circuit. And if we think that way, then it's going to be really hard for us to have a meaningful life as any of any kind of faith. It's just going to be difficult. Um, but the first thing you have to do is you have to just level with yourself. I mean, it doesn't matter about anybody else. You have to level with yourself and realize that as a Christian, I make some wild claims. At the very foundation of the earth, I believe that a God who I have never seen, who's never been physically seen, or no one has ever interacted with him in my lifetime that I'm aware of physically. There are people who claim that, but I have not, in my experience, ever seen him or had a physical conversation with him where he's sitting across from me. But yet I believe that God created everything that is in existence, and that same God cared enough about the creation that he created to then put together a plan and lay out, everything that we see happen throughout the course of human history, and even the history of creation itself. And so those are some wild claims that we have to just put out there, that we can't prove that. Now, we can say that we believe it because the Bible says it, and that's, if that's your thing, then okay. But we can't prove it, beyond a shadow of a doubt, like this is a court of law. But the thing that we have to be okay with is that is okay. Nobody's asking you to prove it. And if they do, your simple answer should be, I can't. But that's what faith is. That's the reason you have faith. And that's why faith drives us, is because it's not something that we can physically show, but it's something that it internally and intrinsically it moves us. It gives us meaning, it gives us purpose, it drives us to do what we feel like we've been created to do. And that's where we find our purpose. And that's the beauty of our faith. Um, but until we get that out of the way, you really can't build from there. So it's kind of like a baby. You can't move past that milk until you understand that. And no matter how hard you try, and there are going to be people who hear this that vehemently disagree with me, and that's okay. There are going to be people who say, I absolutely can believe that God spoke the world into existence. I absolutely believe that, the Old Testament version of how things went, and then the story of Jesus and how he was conceived and how he was born, and his life and his death and his burial and his resurrection and all of that stuff. I can absolutely prove that that's correct. But all you're going to be able to do is show me the Bible and show me these scriptures and these teachings and things. It doesn't mean they're wrong, but it doesn't mean that that is 100% like everyone has to believe that, because that is, do you understand what I'm saying? Is that making
Absolutely.
sense?
Yes.
And so if we don't get past that, if we never get past that, then it's going to be really impossible for us to grow in faith. Because if we don't get past that, then when we get into some deeper subjects about like, why is there pain in the world? Why are people dying that I love? Why are children dying? Why are there wars? Why are people killing each other? If you can't come to that conclusion, that I don't have to have an answer for everything. Sometimes my answer can be, I don't know. And that's okay.
And that's okay. Yes.
And that's okay. And so that is the why for conversational Christianity, is that we want to have these discussions about things that sometimes we can't explain. Um, we can give, but we need to have a reason for why we believe them, other than it's what I've always been taught. It needs to be our reason. It needs to be our experience. It needs to be research that we have done and that the conclusion that we have come to, not that someone has poured into our lives or told us that we should believe. And that goes for every area of life. It's not just faith. It's every area of life. So, we've got a few more minutes here. Um, I, I want to, my final thing that I want to say is simply this: don't come to conversational Christianity thinking that, again, I want to reiterate, we're not subject matter experts. Yes, I am an ordained minister. I've preached and taught for a while. I do enjoy studying scripture and listening to philosophers and Christian writers and Christian biblical scholars. I also enjoy listening and reading to atheistic writers and podcasters and teachers and people who are agnostic and have these other thoughts and other worldviews and stuff. I enjoy listening to some of those things and some of those thoughts. So I do have opinions on a lot of things, and I do have a lot of experience and beliefs and why I believe what I believe and how my faith has changed over the last 20 years. Like, I have all of those things, but I'm not saying that you should listen to what I'm saying and think that, oh, I've got to follow this guy blindly, because that's going to lead you down a road that's not good. But what I can tell you is that in these conversations, we're not always going to agree. We are two different personalities and people, and that's why I think this is a good pair. We're not always going to agree, but one thing that in college, I had this group of guys that we met 3 or 4 times a week, and we would always have these deep conversations about our faith and other things, and a lot of times they would get heated. And at the very, very end, after we had sometimes like been very angry and yelling and screaming, we would always end the conversation with saying, iron sharpens iron. And basically what it meant to us is that we may talk about some deep topics and we may disagree vehemently about those topics. But at the end of the day, we still love each other. We're still friends, and we're still on the same team.
Mhm.
And iron sharpens iron. And so there's going to be times when, not necessarily that you and I are disagreeing that way, but people who are listening are completely disagreeing. We're asking that when you listen, that you don't just come into this conversation and think, oh, I'm going to listen to what Alex and Dalton have to say today so that I can pick it apart. Listen to it. Listen to our opinion. Listen to our conversation and why we believe those things, and the guests that we have on, and then form your opinion. And then if you want to send us a message or email us or text us, if you've got our numbers or whatever, and have a discussion, great. We may bring you on the show and have that discussion, actual live. Um, but those are just some things that I think are important to understand here in the pilot episode. And then going forward, we will jump into topics. But I'm excited for this a lot.
Yeah, me too.
So, all right. Well, that's going to end the first episode. Alex, any last words? Sound like I'm about to execute you.
Oh man, I should have.
This is your opportunity to scream out freedom.
Okay. Reference to this. Okay. bad
Megan.
reference for conversational Christianity, but for anybody familiar with the Whitest Kids You Know, do you have any last words? Yes, just 3. Yes,
That's it.
yes, just 3. So, yeah, I'm poor joke, but nah, I'm excited to do this. I'm excited uh, to hang out and just talk and kind of see where it goes. Had a lot of good conversations with a lot of people already
Yeah.
about what they kind of hope to hear and talk about and things like that. Hope that it's helpful. Um, as Dalton said, we are not subject matter experts. You may walk away from here going, those 2 guys are idiots. And let's be clear, we're both white males in our 30s. We're not exactly that diverse either. So if you got
Yeah.
a different experience than us, share. Love to hear
That's
it.
that's it. That is it. That's why it's called conversational,
Right,
not expert Christianity, because
right.
experience means a lot.
Mm,
Experience means a lot. And I will say my opinion on a lot of things, not just faith, but my opinion on a lot of things have changed because I've been exposed to new experiences.
yeah, yeah.
So that's important to understand. So, all right. Well, that's going to do it for the first episode of Conversational Christianity. This is episode 1, What and Why. Man, it's in the books.
In the books. Thank you for joining us.
See y'all next time.